Everybody has a family. So just a reminder to everybody who's listening, who's not in the room, if you're viewing this on the live stream, all the materials that are being shared and discussed can be found online at www.muni.org/assembly and then clicking the housing button. So next up, we're going to have a conversation with members Wallen and Cross, who are going to share an update on actions since the last retreat, with Ellie Hartman, who's going to join the discussion about current actions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is my second Assembly Housing retreat. And I know that earlier it was mentioned, we have these conversations and then sometimes it feels like there was a lot of ideas and not a lot of action. But as the chair mentioned in his opening remarks, I think this assembly is really interested in taking action and has taken action. And so I wanted to share about a couple of things that were sort of birthed out of our previous housing retreat. One of those was the elimination of parking minimums as a sort of attempt to do multiple things. Number one, make it easier to build housing and to prioritize space for people rather than cars. Number two, to allow for adaptive reuse of vacant buildings that are sitting empty, and allowing any type of business to be able to go into those buildings. Number three, to create more connected spaces, green spaces, and then also to try to help facilitate non-motorized travel. Right now we have an issue with things being separated, huge surface area parking lots that push things ever further apart. And so I just wanted to share one example that I think is pretty special, that I received an email from Victor Malozzi, who's the chair of the Anchorage Affordable Housing and Land Trust. And he shared with me, he said, "Thank you for leading the charge to eliminate parking requirements. We have 96 units at the Barrett with lots of unnecessary parking. As an example, at the guest house, we only have 9 tenants out of 130 that have cars. As a result of the parking change, we're planning to rip up the asphalt in the back section of the Barrett parking lot, bring in topsoil, plant some mature trees, and install park benches and picnic tables. Our tenants will be living in small converted hotel rooms, and they need outdoor space. We don't necessarily want our customers to feel like they have to hang out on street corners. We envision a small park that will give our tenants a place to relax, meet other tenants, hopefully, and make some friends and enjoy the fresh air." So just kind of a cool real world tangible update that I think speaks to a couple things. Number one, what you can do to create nice spaces in Anchorage, but also just the fact that, as you said, the guest house, 9 tenants out of 130 that have cars. I think that is really important. We assume everybody drives in Anchorage, and that is not always the case. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Member Cross.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, that's inspiring and great to hear. Sometimes when we put in these large changes to code and land use, most of what we receive is the sky is falling. But then what happens is the reality of the situation is that because we've spent hours and hours, if not weeks and months, of delving into this and researching the data, you see things like this actually pay out. And that transfers over into additional dwelling units. We passed the ADU, and we heard a lot of communities come out and oppose to it. And they were scared that everybody's going to put a short-term rental or a VBRO or something in their backyard, but that isn't the case. A large majority of the ADU units that are being passed are people expanding on their existing house. We already talked about how houses are getting smaller, demographically just smaller families. So utilizing that extra seat spot off a garage or an area and converting it into an additional dwelling unit. But who is occupying that? And the numbers show that a majority of those are actually just extended family, adult children, or older parents who are coming back home so they can receive care. And that is a large majority of the ADU, which is really important because as those individuals move closer to work, we're investing in making and keeping families together. And 2, we're taking those individuals out of the rental market and freeing those up for other individuals who needed other working lives. So we see our ADU ordinance working as we would hope it would as well. Why don't we see ADUs just spawning up everywhere? Well, there's still some red tape. If you want to build a little property, if you want to put a little 500, 600 square foot ADU behind your property, it's still required to carve it into or tie it into water and sewer. And if the cost of that is $80,000 to $100,000, you're not going to put a little 600 square foot additional dwelling unit behind your house. So what we see is that, the reality of passing these, and we still have some burdens, and we might go in and make some amendments to ADU. We'll look at that. But right now, I'm just really pleased to see how the intention of allowing people to use unused space within their property legally as an additional dwelling unit without it becoming a duplex, triplex, or coming up with use issues in violation of the land use has been working tremendously well so far. And we look forward to seeing more smart changes like this take place, okay? The other thing that we're working on, which Ali will go into and which I'm really passionate about, which is treating triplexes and fourplexes and maybe further more like residential and less like commercial construction. And then I'm going to pass this off to Ali to speak on our efforts on that. Thank you.
I'm going to steal your mic. How's that sound? Okay, great, thanks. My name is Ali Hartman. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the communications coordinator for the Anchorage Assembly, and I work in legislative services. And our department is here to support the Assembly and members as they pursue legislation, and then also help support outreach and education after that legislation has passed. I have been working with the sponsors of this idea in a working group around treating triplexes and fourplexes more like residential buildings instead of commercial construction. And I think that in this process, we've developed a really strong model for continuing these efforts. And I'm really excited to share that this is a model that I can see replicated, and I think that it's scalable. And so as the conversations that happen today take place, I think that there's this question of, and it was raised as folks introduce themselves, what's different about this conversation compared to conversations in years past? And I think that a big part of what's different is the Assembly's staff support to be able to keep the ball rolling and keep these projects moving forward, keeping stakeholders engaged, and continuing to move the needle, right? The model that I am speaking of is effectively that the sponsors, through community collaborations and input, identify some kind of policy lever that they'd like to pull. And in this case, it's this triplex and fourplex. And so then we identify the folks that need to be around the table. And a lot of times that comes from the Assembly members themselves and who you all speak to and have talked to about these issues. But it might also be thinking more broadly and more creatively about who ought to be at the table and who might be impacted or who might have perspectives that can help weigh in on the issue. So I think that one of the really cool things about this retreat today is that you all are here in the room. Those of you that are tuning in online are engaged in the conversation. And so, I appreciate you being here and being a part of this work, especially as this seed is planted, because I think that there's a real opportunity to continue building relationships that are productive and help move towards these goals. After identifying some stakeholders, we start having roundtable discussions. We're calling them roundtables. And these are meetings where, like this square table configuration, people come together around the room and first discuss maybe some of the challenges, some of the barriers that are presented around the issue. Then we work with the administration to identify what kind of processes or what code is in place that helps to shape what that experience looks like and what relationship the code has with those challenges and barriers. And then we start bringing ideas forward, and it's really collaborative. And I think that this example really demonstrates the ways that this process before the legislation comes to the body for review is collaborative, and it's pretty well vetted because there are lots of people that are coming to the table to help weigh in on the very first draft before it's even introduced. So I'm really excited about this project and seeing it move forward. Of course, once it comes to the body, it'll be routed through lots of different reviews, and there's an opportunity for amendments and so on. The public process will, continue to shape the legislation. And at the end of the day, whatever comes of it, Legislative Services is here to also see that the community and the industries that are involved have the information that they need to then feel empowered by these new tools to go and add more housing units. And so that's the piece of the puzzle that we haven't yet broached with this particular project, but is impending and will be very exciting. So for those of you that are here tuning in online, if you know folks that ought to be a part of these conversations, that might be interested in these conversations, please have them visit the Assembly website. We've got a really great just yellow call to action at the bottom of the website where you can subscribe to email updates from the Assembly. And in addition to the newsletters that come out after every regular Assembly meeting, there's also an option to opt into project updates related to housing. And so that's going to be a really good way to stay engaged on the email side of things. But of course, it also takes a village, right? And it'll take all of you coordinating with your networks and sharing the word as news comes forward and these opportunities come forward. So huge thanks to those of you that have been involved in the triplex fourplex project. Very excited to see that moving forward. And thank you to everybody here today for being a part of this first step in the next process or the next tranche of policy goals. Yeah.
I just real quick want to add why we chose triplex, fourplexes. It didn't extend wide. I think it's really important because you said, why would you go 6 or 8? It's important to realize that in the financing world, up to 4 units is considered residential. And so those are owner occupied loans. And so we're looking to incentivize higher density properties, triplexes and fourplexes, where you're not only solving the housing need for an owner occupant, which creates a community, but also that each time you're resolving the housing needs of others. And the financing terms on triplexes and fourplexes is extremely aggressive compared to non-owner occupied properties. On an individual with a VA loan, the VA loan limit is $1,080,000 for a zero down property. So they could buy a fourplex zero down and live in it for close to rent free. They solved their housing issue and the housing issue for 3 other people. And so if we can streamline those construction processes, we not only create owner occupied properties that build communities, but then we're solving housing problems affordably. And it's nice because you have these smaller density, or I would call mid-density, rather than just 36 units of non-owner occupied. So it helps us expand communities at a reasonable density that we can do quickly with really aggressive and fantastic financing for the end purchaser. So thank you.
Thank you. So for this part of the conversation, we're pretty much out of time. I would note that we've been joined by Karma Reed from HUD, also Maria Gallagher, who is the primary at McKinney Research Group and here in support of ACBA, and also an individual named Linwood Parker, who I believe is with FNBA, maybe here on his personal capacity, I don't know. And then a little bit of data. I did get the information from the National Association of Home Builders. It essentially argues that nationwide 23.8% of the price of a housing unit is regulatory, that approximately 40% of that cost is during the development phase, and then the 60% is during construction. Some of that is safety oriented, but a lot of it is regulatory in general. So with that, we've been asked before we break for lunch and move into the working lunch conversation about housing preference demand, white paper by the planning department, that we all kind of move over by this bookshelf together for a photograph of everybody's here today. And then we're going to march over here and get lunch, and we'll come back and be seated, and we're going to do that in 10 minutes. So everybody, if you don't mind, please come on over by these bookshelves and do a photograph. bring us back on schedule, which means we're going to start with where we left off. Mike Robbins, ACDA, a brief conversation about housing incentive research. Mike, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chairman Constant, and thank you very much for inviting ACDA to the table today and giving us an opportunity to be a part of this. First of all, I just want to say that there are a lot of housing experts and really great people with a lot of great experience in the room, and I am not one of them. So luckily, though, I did bring an expert with me who's going to really share the data and the details of what we're going to be doing with our study. But I do want to just start off by saying that that one of the things that I've seen over the last couple of years as I've had an inside view of what's going on in housing and acreage is that we definitely have a challenge. We have a challenge across the spectrum. Mr. Chairman Perez, you talked about that spectrum and where do we most need housing at the high end, the middle end, and the low end. And I think what I'm seeing is something that someone else said, which is that housing is housing. So if we can build housing at the affordable site, at the affordable spot, that we also create inventory as it rolls up and rolls above. So I think it's important that we're having this conversation at a point that we're looking at the full spectrum. One of the things that we believe at ACDA is that our job is to just cause action. You know, where our job and what we're focusing on right now is trying to cause action in the community when it comes to helping contractors, helping you as the legislative body, helping the administration and the departments. We see our job as sort of a catalyst to cause things to happen, and we're working hard to do that. I have been asked to keep this short, so if I'm putting in the wrong points, I'm sorry. And then lastly, I just want to say that, that we have to build faster, we have to build more, and we have to work together. ACDA is focused on working with this body, the administration, trying to build bridges with all of the departments within the municipality, as well as the legislatures at the state level. This year we introduced SB 77, which would have provided a much needed abatement, giving us the opportunity to pass some full tax abatement for economic purposes, as well as the blighted property. You talked about a number of units in your district that are in need of being repaired. And municipality doesn't have the tools to do that. And we're working to try to get those tools. And with that, I want to introduce Moira Gallagher from McKinley Research. And that's really the focus of our energy, is trying to find out what tools are being used in other places, present those options to this body with a plan of the ones that we believe should be implemented. And then, if need be, go to the state from a policy perspective and try to affect change there as well. So I'm going to introduce now Moira Gallagher from McKinley Research. And if you could just skip all the way to the fifth slide, her slide that says McKinley Research will be good. Go ahead. More. One more. Okay. Nope. Back. One more back.
That one's fine. My name is Moira Gallagher. I have worked with nearly everybody in this room, so I won't spend too much time introducing myself. I work for McKinley Research Group. If you can advance the slide one, you may have known us formerly as McDowell Group. Been around for 50 years doing quantitative and qualitative research, survey projects, community planning. We've been engaged in housing research and community needs assessments. Here in Anchorage, we did a comprehensive report in 2012. We also do projects across the state. Valdez, Ketchikan, and Birdwood are some of the more recent projects that we've done. If you could go forward more. So I don't want to bore you with data that you already know, and I certainly don't want to just repeat Nolan's presentation. I'll just as a baseline where we're starting from is looking at a slide like this, where we see the days on market of houses broken down into different price groups. So 4 groups here. The light blue is houses above 700,000, then it's 500 to 700, 300 to 500, and 300 and under 300. And this isn't news to anyone in the room, but clearly what we're seeing here is the real crunch in inventory, and houses in particular in that middle spectrum, that middle band of 300 to 500,000 are now, on average on the market for 2 weeks. And that's just a crazy statistic. Anyone who's working in real estate, anyone who's buying and selling houses, seeing a house go on the market for $350,000 and getting bought for $50,000 to $100,000 over list price in 48 hours in some cases. So that's just a real testament to lack of housing inventory due to, if you get forward one more slide, This is a look at new residential units that have been constructed over the last 10 years. So what I first want to point out is the green line, which is mobile homes. And we don't talk about mobile homes a ton. There aren't usually a lot of advocates for mobile homes, but call them what you want: tiny homes, cottage homes, high-density housing, micro units. But you can see that we went from, on average, building about 100 of those a year to now building almost none. And whether or not we want more mobile homes in our community, there are people who would have been living in those homes who don't have a place to go because that particular market need isn't being met with new construction. The blue line is single-family homes. The yellow line, which I'll address next, that's multifamily, and that's where we've seen the biggest drop-off, because that went from about 500 units a year in the 2014-2015 time range to now around 200 units a year. Multifamily here is 4 units or more, so that does not include duplexes. That includes, a really multifamily kind of development, and there's just a dramatic drop off. So those people also are struggling to find places to live. And while we've seen a drop off in single family, which also includes duplexes or lot lines, it went down from about 300 a year to around 200 a year. So not nearly the same decline as in those other sectors, but still a decline, and we're still seeing significantly less housing being constructed now than was being constructed 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. Would you go to the next slide? McKinley Research Group has been brought on by ACDA to do research to answer the following questions. What are the barriers that are preventing developers in Anchorage from being able to build smaller housing, multifamily housing, and most importantly, small A affordable housing for that spectrum, that band of the spectrum that's really missing. Those middle income homes, 300 to 500,000, and even lower than 300,000 that aren't coming onto the market, and when they are, they're selling like hotcakes. What are the incentives being used in other communities around the country, or even other communities in Alaska, that are successfully helping to encourage private development of new market rate housing in those areas? Which of those tools are legally available to us in Anchorage right now so that we could begin incentivizing more housing development? And which of those tools are not available to us, possibly because of some constitutionality issues, or because of bills like, deteriorated properties and abatement that need to be passed to give us those, to give us the ability to work with that here in Anchorage. And then lastly, what infrastructure improvements have occurred in other communities that have facilitated more housing development, more small, affordable, multifamily development, and would make that type of housing more likely here in Anchorage. So we'll be delivering the results of this research to you at the Assembly in August. We're really excited about this project because we will be taking a very comprehensive look around the country at creative solutions and creative policy solutions that we can bring to you to begin considering. I also will be reaching out to a lot of you, so expect to see my name in your inbox soon as we do stakeholder interviews, particularly for those of you who are developers in the room. We are trying to get as broad a look as possible at what the barriers are, financial and otherwise, to building this kind of housing in Anchorage right now. So please don't ignore me if I call, and look forward to talking to a lot of old friends in the room. Thanks.
All right, I think that's a little bit more than the time we had for that matter. So Amanda, we aren't closer to getting track on time. That's good. Good content. Next up, we are going to dive right into the presentation by Christine Bunnell and Daniel McKenna-Foster, who are both staff in MOA Long Range Planning. Topic is housing preference and demand, a white paper. You have the floor. And this proposal is supposed to go for like an hour and a half. We might get about an hour and 10 minutes.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, everybody. Again, for anyone new that walked into the room, I'm Christine Bunnell. I'm with Long Range Planning in the MOA Planning Department. And with me is Daniel McKenna-Foster, who is, he's the dream team as far as trying to get this stuff done and put information together for you today. We did work with a large group to do that. We worked with ACDA, we worked with JED in DHHS, we worked with the Assembly folks, and we're just so happy to be here today and that we were included for this. So we did complete a white paper for you all, and it looks like this. And if you didn't get a copy, please go ahead and get a copy because there's a lot of data in here that may not necessarily be on our slide presentation. So page 6 in the white paper talks about housing preference and demand, and that's based on AEDC work that they've done and some other work that the Muni has done. On page 7, there's quite a few different housing projections. And those come from our housing study from 2012, which was updated in 2040 for the 2040 plan. And then we have housing projection in the downtown district plan. And then also the Coalition to End Homeless, they have some numbers in there. And also some projections from AgNewBek. So that's very important because we heard earlier in the day, well, actually, how much housing do we actually need? And what are the types? And so there's information on page 7 that talks about that. We also included the units that have been permitted, and we've gone over that a little bit. Pages 8 through 10 has several different data points. Daniel will talk about a few of those. And then page 11, we have comments from real estate folks and developers from our community. Page 12 goes into a deeper discussion on the proposal. Starting on page 12 begins a deeper discussion on the proposals that are on page 20. And again, this is a document for you to use when we're having our discussion later in the day. And just proposals for, okay, how do we fix it? Well, here's some things that the planning department has found out about with the team. I just wanted to let you all know that the planning department has received unprecedented funding in the last year or so. And the assembly has been part of that. So we've received over $1 million from the assembly to do work to figure out how to help housing happen. We are also receiving about $2.25 million in CDBGR earthquake funding that is helping with housing, but also helping with us to do planning too, to help make housing happen. We've had brownfields funding for quite a few years now, and it looks like we might get a little bit more, fingers crossed. We asked for $1 million, and brownfields funding helps us to prepare properties for housing. So that's an important component of the funding that we get. So with that, I'm gonna hand it off to Daniel.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, let's kick it off. Alex, go to the next slide, please. So again, again, I apologize for the size of this. It started out as a memo that became a pretty lengthy report, plus the appendices. But this conversation, has been going on for a long time. A few months ago, it became clear that many of us were sort of working together on this. So we, municipal planning, long-range planning, has been working with ECDA, AgNewBek, and the health department. And I think we found it to be a really fruitful kind of exercise and working well together and just getting everybody on the same page to make sure we're not duplicating any efforts and we're to get some actionable results here. Next slide, please. So just to sort of set the stage, maybe manage expectations or put it for what we wanted to talk about. We were in the planning department, people always calling, asking, we're looking at projects, we're looking at requests for changes, that sort of thing. And so these are just some of the things that if somebody said, well, what do you think everybody should know about housing? This is kind of where we would start. First of all, housing needs change over time for everybody. Housing markets are regional, but unfortunately for everybody on the assembly, the decisions you make are local. So in many ways, you've been asked to solve a problem that covers a much larger area than what you can actually do stuff with. Transportation and other costs affects housing choice. That's a big one. I always say transportation cost is always a piece of housing cost. There are a lot of factors that influence the cost of construction. Affordable doesn't mean low cost to build. Mario said little a affordable and big A affordable. That's kind of one of those things. I think a lot of times the public says, well, why don't we just build more affordable housing? What does affordable mean? Do you mean income restricted? Do you mean housing that's affordable to incomes at 30%? Which level of, which demographic do you mean? So that's just one thing to always keep in mind. The gap analysis is part of the Our Downtown plan. We had AgNewBek put together a really useful document that showed that there is just a gap in how to make a project work and make a project pencil, as they say, if you want to get just more market rate housing. ACDA has done a lot of work on that, the Block 96 project we'll talk about a little bit later. Local government is participating to fill the gap. So I know, people say, well, what's going on? Why isn't anybody doing anything? I would say Anchorage is doing things. The state also needs to participate in filling the gap. We'll talk about some recent data points. And then what we consider maybe the biggest returns for the investment, just in terms of what's politically viable, what seems to make sense with the way the codes are now. And then finally, some potential actions to carry through with those. So next slide, please. So again, I think this is one of the most important things I think as planners we can emphasize is that all of our housing needs change over time. And that means we do need a diverse housing stock to make up for that. I think most people kind of imagine, oh, I'm going to live in a single family home. That doesn't always work for everybody. It's not always everybody's preference. But even if that is a person's preference, they're still likely to need a variety of types of single family homes within that time. So as we're young, whatever kind of family we grow up in, our needs change as we become a young adult. And then as we move through life, we change. We need different types of housing. And then again, as we get older, people also find that their house is too big and they can't really live in that house as well anymore. Maybe the stairs are uncomfortable. Maybe they can't afford the cost to run it because their income is reduced. So really, I think it's always helpful to think about as we have these discussions, the best type of housing market is one that has a really diverse range of housing types, because all of us will need some of these types at some point in our life. Even if we say, no, that's not where I would live. Well, things might change, right? You might lose your job. You might have a tragedy in your family. You might have to change. And having those options available is really to the net benefit of everyone. Next slide, please. Another thing is housing markets are regional. This is just a screenshot from Zillow, but we all know when people move to Anchorage or when people try to move around Anchorage, nobody says, okay, I only want to look in the municipality and I won't look anywhere else. People are looking at price. They're making these decisions, they're making these considerations, and they'll look at the entire housing market. So again, that's difficult for you all as policymakers, because you're kind of constrained. The decisions you make are mostly within the municipal boundary. Next slide, please. So this one we've kind of talked about a little bit. Ali, can you press forward? It'll bring up the next, in how, I was thinking it's a bit like a game of musical chairs, right? And so if you only have so many chairs, the people with more economic power are going to be able to get more chairs. And the people with less economic power are going to be able to get fewer chairs. So if you could press forward one more time. So as the chairs start to go away, the people who have more of that housing bidding power are going to just be able to get more of the available housing. So this is, some people see this and they say, oh, well, we need to stop this. We need to put restrictions on. I would say often it's easier just to add more chairs. I was kind of thinking if I came in here and Christine doesn't have a chair, I'm going to give Christine my chair, right? And then we say, Craig, he's Christine's boss. Well, then we better give that chair to Craig. Fortunately, we can just add more chairs to the room. It's not as easy to just add more chairs, add more houses to Anchorage, but it's one thing to think about that if you have higher income, higher range of housing available that you can bid into, even if it's not in the quality you want or it's not in the state you want, it's a little older than you want, but you're going to be able to buy that even if it goes for $50,000, $100,000 we're asking, whereas in a normal market it might do that. You'll have the power to do that, but the people at the bottom end of the spectrum simply won't. And the other issue too is that for the income restricted properties, those are almost always full as far as I know, and so there's always a shortage of those as well. So this is just kind of a piece of, it is a large kind of market. It is a large game of musical chairs. And when you limit the number of chairs, it makes things difficult, especially for people at the lower ends. Next slide, please. This is just something from the U.S. Department of Transportation emphasizing that transportation is a component of housing cost. It often doesn't go into affordability matrix or metrics. So it's something that should always be considered, right? You say, oh, I've got this great house out in Matsu. My housing payment's only $2,000. Well, what's your time cost now to get out there? What's your maintenance cost? The point of this is sort of emphasize the municipality can do things about housing. They could also potentially think about, well, what can we do to make transportation costs lower? Is there anything we can do? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Next slide, please. Another thing too is that just general costs, right, of internet, electricity, water, sewer, gas, trash service. Some of these, when we're having these discussions, I think it's easiest if we just look for one number and say, well, how much does it cost? But it's also useful to remember that there are all these other costs. And for the average person, they see that. But when we're having these discussions, it's easy to say, oh, what's the mortgage cost? Or what's the rent? Not remembering there's all this other stuff too, transportation, all the utilities and all the other stuff as well. Next slide, please. So this was maybe about a month ago, we did this, we just did an exercise and say, okay, I just got hired as a teacher at ASD. So the starting salary is $55,168. And I was like, I'm gonna move in on July 1st. And I didn't know about utilities. Press forward if you could, thank you, Alan. So, and you're working at Hanshu Middle School, press forward again. And so we looked at, okay, within 1.5 miles, say you wanted to walk to work, maybe do, maybe don't, maybe move a bike to work. What is available at that income range, just in terms of rentals? Maybe you want to buy, but when you first move up, in this market, you're probably going to rent first. And again, this is just looking at apartments.com, but I was trying to think of a person moving to Alaska to take a job that everybody, that we need. What are they facing? And I apologize, the screen's not very large, but basically, we couldn't find anything listed that opens on July 1st that you could rent for less than 30% of the income, of that salary. And 30% is kind of the rule of thumb that nobody should pay more than 30%. If you do, then you're cost burdened. There's some limitations to that as well. But this was kind of telling, right? Because if we put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who's looking to move or looking to come up here, what do they find? And in this case, in a situation like working at Hanshu, they found there wasn't much available. If you go further out, there is more stuff available within that income range, but that, of course, is increasing some of your other costs like transportation. Next slide, please. And if you can forward, yeah. So we're grateful that we have good relationships and talking with people who are building the housing. Press one more, I think, Sean, there we go. So we're constantly asking, well, what do you see? What are the costs? What are the big costs in relation to development? So these are 3 quotes we got from Andre Spinelli, Mark Feynman from CIHA, and Sean Debenham. And people just, so what is going on? So it's true, zoning is a cost, but there are a lot of other costs too. Andre saying land, well, some of the offsite developments, but lumber is expensive, cost of money is expensive. CIHA talking about dirt work utilities, some of that is in Title 21, some is in Title 23. And then Sean Debenham was working on the Block 96 projects and did something over at Raspberry. He was talking about, we have some of these tax abatement programs in play, the AOs, but then does the municipality, will it be able to honor those long term? That was a big concern he expressed. Next slide, please. I mentioned a bit before, we've been working a lot with Agnew Beck, especially during the Our Downtown Plan and code update. One of the best things that Shanna, who's sitting over here, produced is this sort of analysis that shows that there's a big gap in what builders can build versus what the market will bear in terms of rental rates. And so this is sort of the case for, well, why should we do a tax abatement? Why should we offer this? It's so that we can get more housing in the places that we want housing. Because if there's this gap right now, we found that with no incentive, no tax abatement or patient capital or land write-down, there's a gap between $120,000 between what the builder can spend to build versus what they can get with market rents. And so again, if you don't do it, then it just doesn't get built, right? So it comes down to, this is, I think somebody else said, an investment in getting more housing in the community. Next slide, please. So just a word on affordable, again, big A affordable versus little a affordable. Affordable housing, it has different definitions. Sometimes people say it's housing at 80% of the median. This is what I got from HUD. Affordable housing is narrow-fied housing which the occupant is paying no more than 30% of gross income for housing costs, including utilities. That doesn't say anything about income, right? If I make $5 million a year, my affordable housing is a lot different from somebody who makes $50,000 a year. And so with this, we always try to emphasize the amount of money for any sort of income-restricted housing development is limited, right? We can't just say, hey, Tyler, why don't you get some affordable units for us? There may be low-income housing tax credits might not be available. The financing might not be available. Next, please. And in terms of the muni or any city doing that, if the muni takes on that burden, then you have to have somebody who is consistently verifying all that information, looking at the tenants and saying, do you meet the income requirements? Are we following federal compliance or other state compliance? Next, forward one, please. So again, it's a little more tricky than let's just build affordable. I'm sure everybody here knows that, but often, in discussions, people say, well, let's just build more affordable housing. Affordable housing or income restricted housing takes a lot more. And for a lot of developers, it's complicated enough to get one thing built. To build one thing and then have to deal with managing it long-term with specific types of tenants according to specific types of rules, it becomes a less attractive proposition. And then one more final. So The final thing too is affordable income restricted housing. The costs to buy the lumber are exactly the same, right? You don't get a discount on lumber just because you're building an affordable unit. The financing might be more expensive. But, if you look at some income restricted product, the capital stack, the number of funders is kind of mind boggling sometimes. A little bit of money here, assembling that, managing that, all that takes time. So it's not that we shouldn't be doing this, or this isn't bad, but it's not quite as simple as we should just build more affordable housing. Next slide, please. And if you could press one more. So this is, low-income housing tax credits are kind of the main way that income-restricted housing gets built in the United States, and they're distributed by population. So you can see that Alaska gets very few low-income housing tax credits because we just don't have that much of a population. So that's another thing too, and they're shared statewide. So affordable projects are competing with developments in Fairbanks or Kodiak or Juneau. So that's just another limitation, that there isn't that much money out there for dedicated specific income restricted housing. Next slide, please. Another thing too is, and we'll put together a better map of this, but we have our 2040 land use atlas here. One of the maps in there is just public ownership of land. People often say, well, why don't we open up some land? And that's a discussion worth having, including state lands, right? There's a lot of state lands in the municipality owned by maybe UAA, maybe the Trust Land Office, maybe AKDOT and public facilities. So that's something worth considering. Next slide, please. So now the main kind of point of the original white paper was a big point of the genesis of all this was we went back and we looked at all the plans from about 2013 and all the housing projections. And we wanted to kind of compile that and look and say, what have people been saying for all these years? What have we done? What haven't we done? How do we not repeat that process? So you'll see that in the housing white paper, in the appendices, it's all, we went through and we just took out all the recommendations from them. So if there's one type of action or implementation policy, like you can look back and see, oh, this was mentioned in 2014 and in 2016 and in 2018, et cetera. Next slide, please. And so I did mention too, local government is doing stuff, the assembly is doing stuff, the municipality is doing stuff. So unit subdivision, parking reform, ADU reform, reinvestment focus area, the RFA update, downtown code reform, the R4A, which is the mixed use zone update, which is currently in process, the 4-unit housing downtown tax incentive, fair use downtown tax abatement zone, transit corridor tax incentive, and CPACER program. So there is stuff going on, and so the question is, well, is it working? How can we make it work more? Are there other things that can work, right? Next slide, please. So one thing I wanted to emphasize is that the ADU reform was passed by the Assembly in January, and one of the requirements they told us in the planning department, we want you to start tracking this. So I really want to thank Development Services, especially Lance, for getting all the departments together, because now we have a tracking system for ADUs on the permits. And we're going to make this public eventually if we can get the interface right, to just show that here are the ADU permits that are coming in. So that is in process. That was passed by the Assembly. This is, I think, in March, we already saw 4 applications come in. So again, it wasn't by any means a waterfall, but it's more than what we might have seen traditionally. And we're working more on getting this information publicly available so everybody can see kind of this reform went through, what were the impacts, and everybody can assess that. Next slide, please. Yeah, if you could just press forward maybe 4 times. So this is also another thing, is who builds what type of housing. I think for a lot of people, they say, well, why does the community just build housing? Most public, most governments don't build any housing anymore. A lot of it goes to NGOs and institutions like CHA or NeighborWorks. Governments they will fund some of the lower income stuff. Commercial builders will work on more of the median income stuff and higher. But one thing we talk about a lot is how can we make it easier for the individual property owners, who are the people who might have a different appetite for risk, or might have a little more flexibility or a little more time to work on a project? What can we do to get them building more? As Mr. Cross mentioned, the financing allows you to get into a fourplex fairly easily. So there are people out there who say, hey, I got a little bit of money. Maybe I could try doing this. I got a call the other day. Somebody, he and his sister inherited 2 lots in Spinard. And he said, hey, I'd like to build some housing. What'd you like to build? I don't know, maybe a 6-plex, 8-plex. He said, well, okay, let's look at the zoning. Let's see what we can do. But it seemed like a perfect opportunity, right? We have somebody who's interested in trying to add units in an area that's in the Spinard corridor. It's designated as a transit supportive corridor. By all respects, great, right? And he's willing to spend his own money on it, right? And he's willing to go through the process potentially to subdivide and do it. So that's something we talk about a lot is how do we make it easy for somebody like that who's going to add units to the housing stock to do it? And it doesn't take any public cost subsidy. It doesn't take any long-term public maintenance. So it's sort of a sustainable way to do it in a cost-constrained environment. Next slide, please. So to close out, we'll just talk about 3 recent data points. Checkpoint subdivision that Andre did, McCain Loop project that Tyler and Siha did, Block 96 that ACDA did. And if I say anything incorrect about any of these, I hope any of you will jump in. But again, this is really valuable for our work when we see these projects coming in and we see them moving through the process and we can identify, well, what didn't work with this or what were the issues here? Next slide, please. And press forward one more. Thank you. Yeah, so the Checkpoint subdivision, this is a larger parcel out in East Anchorage. And it's kind of cool. It's sort of a small lot subdivision. And Andre went through that, and it wasn't without its difficulties, right? And you look in the East Anchorage district plan and you say, we want smaller lots. We want this kind of thing. And so we saw this going through. We thought, well, this makes a lot of sense. The development community will build this. They've seen that there's a market for it. This is the kind of thing that maybe this could be easier to do rather than going through a PUD or any of the other processes. And Andre did a really nice write-up on all of this. And so this is kind of informed, as we were looking at other things, and as we were working on R4A too, we're thinking people might be uncomfortable with tall density, right? But if something like this, where they can still access that home ownership piece, if that's what they want, this gets a pretty good density that brings in more people, creates more households, and a lot of people are comfortable with it. I think it was a PUD. Oh, I'm sorry. A PUD is a planned unit development. So it's sort of a special process by which you enter into the municipality and you can sort of get to a different set of standards that align with the intent of the code, but it's sort of a slower process with a lot more interaction working between the municipality and the developer. Next slide, please. McCain Loop project, CEHA was very generous to us. They took us out and they showed us around some really cool use of an interesting shaped lot in Spinard, great area right along Fish Creek. Really cool building design, some triplex, duplex. I think triplex is the highest one, and CEHA put together kind of a whole list of, well, here are the things, here are the obstacles we faced. And I think there's no better way to start thinking about these discussions than look at the people who've just gone through it and the designs and the builders and just see what they say. Next slide, please. The final example to talk about is Block 96 Flats, which was a public-private partnership between ACDA and Devonham Properties. So this is going up downtown, looks great, pretty exciting to see that with K Street Market. But again, it took a lot of work and there was a lot of investment on a lot of sides to get that moving. So 48 market rate rental units. ACDA invested $1.8 million on this $11.6 million project. I think Mike was at a 50-year land lease. Yeah. So it took a lot of work to get this done. And this is just 48 units downtown. We need, our projections for our downtown showed we need a couple hundred units, I think, downtown. 4,700 overall. So, yeah. So, but again, it's a great start. And this is the kind of thing that we can say, does this work? What can we do better next time? What's working? What isn't? Next slide, please. So in the white paper and up here, you'll see our kind of chart of what we thought, well, maybe these are some of the things that could make development housing easier. And this is really us sitting down and thinking, well, what can be done within the existing code? Where's their policy guidance for it? What seems like, maybe a politically difficult thing to do or a harder conversation to have? And what is within sort of the realm of this body and sort of all the other institutions. So we talked about lot size reform again, because that kind of came up a lot in the last year. And also, if you look in the zoning code, if you look in the purpose statements, it calls for higher densities in many places than the current lot sizes allow. So that's one thing we said, look, it's already in the zoning code that this area is intended for between 9 and 12 units per acre. So if people want to build to that density, it's kind of already supported. Targeted rezones, I know that's been something that was identified in the 2040 plan, and something that our office has tried with some industrial areas. But that's another thing. If you want to change, you say, oh, in this area, we really want more housing. So the assembly is going to take on that role of changing the land use designation there, or the zoning designation. Code simplification, just getting to a code that's just much more easier to use, maybe as Mr. Martinez, if I understood right, sort of a more kind of universal process, a more direct way to do that. That's of course, it's never as easy as it looks. There's a lot of processes in here overlapping, but that's something that we've seen recommended in a lot of the plans we looked at, and something that many people often talk about. Up to 4 units is residential construction. That's another discussion that's going on right now. Federal grant applications, as Christine mentioned, EPA Brownfield, CDBG-DR. One thing we've done with the Brownfield money is we did area-wide planning downtown, which is a great process to look at that. So we were able to do some assessments on properties and then provide a plan to sort of encourage investment there. And then another thing is a brownfield redevelopment loan. The EPA will give you money, and you, as long as you use it for several years in accordance with their rules, you can keep the program income and essentially have your own brownfield fund. One limitation to that is you basically need a full-time person to do it. It's kind of a capacity issue. Next slide, please. Looking out further afar in the municipality, looking at process improvement and development services, you'll see in some of the more recent reports or the plans done, I think it's been announced. Oh, sorry, go back one. Fee and lieu maybe for development, off-site. There's always a cost when people have to put in a street or fix an alley. And there's been some discussion of, well, what if a development could just put money in so that when the muni comes by later, it does the street all at once rather than sort of piecemeal development. Land assembly is something that has come up in a number of plans, and the muni could take an active role in finding parcels, combining them, and then saying, we would like to see this type of development on this parcel that is currently publicly owned. And then tax abatement, right? There are some tax abatements in place, but there's some issues with state law. So is the school tax included in that or not? Is the period long enough? Is the geographic area right? So those are some other things. And then one final, next please. Another thing too is and looking at tariff structure changes in terms of if we want to build the infrastructure first and then have the development come in later, what does that look like for getting things like water utilities? And is there a way to kind of change that and align that with planning to open up kind of new areas that right now might not be accessible to that sort of development? Next slide, please. So in all of this, again, a classic planner trying to manage expectations and just say that there's a lot that can be done, and I think it will produce results, but this is sort of like in removing a dam, it takes some time before you might see results. So if something is done this year, it might be 2, 3, 4, 5 years before you really see it. Allie, if you could forward one. So, it might take some time before the fish come back, but it's the kind of thing where it's good to try things. It's good to kind of look at what's available and also do it, but then we should maybe temper expectations about how quick or how fast the results will be, so that nobody expects, oh, we're going to do one thing and things will change overnight. That can be both good and bad, right? I know with ADUs, people thought this is going to be really bad. The thing is, it won't. ADUs aren't that expensive. We'll get some kind of slow trickling in, and that's probably good. It means that we get a gradual change, which makes a lot more sense for people getting accustomed to it and comfortable with it. So next, please. That's all from us. We're happy to answer any questions.
So, Mr. McKenna Foster, you mean eliminating parking minimums isn't going to solve the housing crisis?
Just give it one more year, maybe.
Okay, well, thank you. I have myself in the queue first, and I was looking at that Devontown project, 48 units, $1.8 million of cash investment plus tax investment. It's an expensive project for the public to be investing in a private endeavor for revenue generation for a corporation that's going to last for a long, long time. And it certainly begs the question, where is the value of our investment? Like, how do we put that on the scale? Because every developer would like us to write them a $2 million check and not provide them with the tax bill for the next 10 years or 12 years. And so there are some considerations we have to chew on from a policy level about where is the sweet spot for those tools. There was one on your high energy or high investment, and that was like tax abatement across the city for 8 units of housing. Boy, and we're transferring money at that point from one pocket to another, private to public. So I have some thoughts and concerns about that, but this report is really quite amazing, and I'm really grateful for it. So I don't really have a question, I just have to put that on the table. And then I have a cue, and that is starting with Ms. Bradley.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll echo, this was really amazing information. Also, just making a quick disclosure, I work for Agnew-Beck Consulting. I have in the past worked on projects like this, but have not been actively working on any of this. So great to see what my coworkers have been up to. But I was wondering if you could go back to the slide. I don't know what number, but it's the one showing basically the buying power, higher income and lower income, or maybe framed as more and less choice in the market.
I think it's slide number 6.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think, I just want to call our attention back to that, because I think it's one dimension of what Cameron had brought up earlier, which is the different tiers in the market. You know, another way to look at it would be generation or, you know, different life situations. But at first, I really just want to point this out because I think your metaphor of the musical chairs is appropriate. When we don't increase supply, then we're basically competing for what is something, basically an aging inventory, right? That becomes less and less affordable, or people sit on those homes and don't put them back in the market. But I guess my question is if you could comment on, so generally, unless there's a subsidy, what we're building now is what's profitable. So can you maybe just generally characterize from your understanding, what types of housing are we building right now and where do they fall on this market? And again, thinking maybe not the ones with public subsidy or like the ones that Cook and Leonard building, but just, pure private market.
Yeah, I think better to ask might be Andre or anybody else who's actually building them, if they want to weigh in. I don't want to put you on the spot.
I think what I would say is, generally speaking, the last maybe 8 years or so, we've seen the market shift towards more expensive housing. As far as new construction goes, a lot less on the lower end scale. And the reason for that is because, say, an East Anchorage townhome, which is one of my most affordable units that I built in Anchorage, it's similarly priced to, say, an older single-family home in the same neighborhood. So it's got its own lot and its yard. And so I have to compete with those, and people would probably, remodeling and updating your home, and it's all more popular than maybe it used to be. Maybe not, but either way. So people tend to choose that, single-family home over that. And so therefore, then I end up building less of those period of super low interest rates. So people can afford, to spend a lot more money on a home. So they were doing it. And so we've really been building a lot more of what I would generally call move-up homes rather than starter homes. And so that's kind of just generally what I would say the market has been doing. And interest rates are up now, and I'm kind of anticipating a shift back and kind of adjusting the homes I build on speculation to do that. Like, okay, we're going to build a smaller house with less upgrades, and the realtors, like my realtors push back on that, like everybody needs quartz countertops. I'm like, no, not 6 months from now. I think that we'll be able to sell it if it costs less. And so the market kind of shifts back and forth like that. I've seen it happen over my career, and I think that that's kind of where we are.
And if I can, Mr. Chair, and you know this from your industry, I mean, if you're building at that new construction at that lower price point, you're fighting the appraisals. As costs go up, the appraisal is often not giving you the cost. So you can say the market, but it's the appraisal as well, and so you're fighting it. And so the margins that exist that are safer for builders are just at those higher price points. It's obvious that's where they go.
I'm going to jump in there and just say we have one person who works for a financial institution in the room, and that's 100% more than we had the last time we met. And I think that is a very important perspective to have in the room, because I think it's a two-way street in any given market, that the appraisal is based on the market and the independent appraisal, but the lender has a lot of swing in what they're looking at. And so for future work, it would be nice to include some folks from the lending industries as participants to make sure we have a full perspective. I'm going to briefly backtrack from the conversation and just note that in the room, we've also been joined by Crystal Hope from Girdwood, Devin Kelly from Within Housing, and Peter Taylor from Habitat for Humanity. And then I have Mr. Salt in the queue.
Thank you. So Daniel, you showed a slide that one of your recommendations was lot size reform. And I can tell us from the room at the CEDC, we talked about shrinking lot size, and we kind of came to the conclusion it really wasn't that big of a lever to pull. So can you just explain that more and what you see? And I think it goes around, if we cut a lot size from 6,000 to 5,000, what does that do now? You have a 6,000 lot that has a 1,000-foot piece on it. So explain more how that would work.
Yeah, thank you. So we put low hurdle and high hurdle because low hurdle is just going through and looking at what the code says right now and says this is intended for 12 to 15 or 15 to 20 and aligning lots as bet on that. And that may or may not make a difference, right? But I can, in the example I just gave where somebody called in and wanted to do this with the lots, there's an issue too now where there are different lot size minimums apply to different use types within the same zone. So there was 2 lots, one was about 7,000, one was about 9,000. The guy and his sister would have to maybe combine or do that. I think that the flexibility of that is just allowing more flexibility with smaller pieces of land. And the best case is, of course, Houston, which went through a big lot size reform, I don't know, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. But Houston, Texas, yeah. But if you look on Google Maps and just look around anywhere in Houston, you see these really diverse housing types all over. And it's just like one lot was subdivided into 3, right? And so I think that's the kind of thing where in a lot of other places in the United States, that has yielded some results because it enables the small-time person to say, you know what, I'm going to try and make the most of this. And it just gives a little bit more flexibility. And the other piece, too, is that lot sizes generally are there to regulate density if that's the traditional reasoning for them. So they're just kind of some discussions there. That's why the high hurdle is reducing them kind of bowl wide because it's then looking at, well, are people comfortable with different densities? But our recommendation there was just because all over the country, there's a lot of other evidence that suggests that reducing lot sizes does allow a little bit more flexibility. And just anecdotally, I've seen when people come in, they've kind of run into some of these issues. The checkpoint subdivision we looked at, most of those lots are between 3,000 and 5,000 square feet. And I think until recently, the minimum lot size in the bowl was about 6,000. You could get 3 townhomes on one 6,000 square foot lot, but there are a lot of different shaped lots throughout the municipality. I mean, even downtown, there were a bunch of lots that were below 5,000, 4,000. So it just kind of opens those up for potential redevelopment. What the exact specifics are would be a policy for.
So maybe instead of parking at an allotment owns.
Mr. Chair, quick follow-up. In the white paper packet, there's the gap funding working group technical memorandum, which is in the appendices, one of the appendices. And we had a gap funding working group for the downtown plan, which included several folks from different banks in town here. And while we did talk about tax incentives as one of the tools to bring new housing, there's also some other incentives which we included in our table of recommendations too. So that's there for you.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to jump in on this slide that you have up. I would love for you to think about it again and come back with a new version. It's missing the middle. I understand it's simplified. High income households and low income households. But it's missing the middle. And what would be really great to do is to take your people you have there and scale them to the size of the percentage of actual market so people can see actually who's able to buy what and what tier. And so I would argue add the middle and then make it scaled to actual.
Yeah, we would like to improve this, and this is improved thanks to Jed for suggesting we put the median family incomes down. We'd also like to break it down by employment types also as well and kind of place that and say, if you're a starting teacher, this is kind of where, so it's in development.
Thank you. It's very instructive. So next in the queue, I have Ms. Otto.
Great, thank you. I think another thing you can add to this slide is like basically what's the hourly wage you need to make in order to afford something. But that wasn't why I got the cue. So I'm gonna ask you the magic wand question. If you had a magic wand and could make one change that would significantly impact housing, and I'm gonna extend it both to you from planning, but also to Mr. Robbins and see what that might be.
Thank you, Member Zalatel. So if I had the ability to wave a magic wand, I think it would be the creation and formation of an infrastructure bank that could take that cost out of development for builders and look at that as an investment by the city and our utilities and our service providers. In the jurisdiction where I'm from, for example, the city puts all of the infrastructure in, and then the builders connect to it. It's the city's, should be our infrastructure, so.
I guess I'd say probably lot sizes, just because some of it is already in code, so politically it wouldn't be that, it's just sort of implementing what's already in the purpose statement. The other thing I might do, and I've mentioned this someplace before, is that within the comp plan, we have the whole future land use designations, right? What's supposed to be there in the future. So maybe a process where if people wanted to, they could elect to just more quickly rezone into the areas that are already planned for that. So, you know, I have an R1, a low density lot in an area that's designated for city center. The plan has kind of already said, in the future, this will be a different type of activity. So if I want to upzone to that, it would be a lot easier to go through that in a quicker process or a no-fee process, or really maybe avoiding that process where it just adds a lot of cost and time, when the plan, which should be representing the needs of the community and the will of the community, has already stated that in the future, this is what we want this to be. So those would be my two.
I'm not going to be very popular. I think we need to look at mobile home parks and where we can put a few more mobile home parks. If you drive around our mobile home parks that we have in our city, for the most part, what I've seen is people love living there. They have their own little piece of a building, they have their own little piece of property, they can have their little garden, they can park their cars. And I know mobile home parks are not a fun thing to talk about, but they could go in quickly.
Thank you. I'm with you there. Manufactured housing, I think, is something we really need to look into, and I think there's some good opportunities for that. I guess, Andre, did you have a magic wand ask or idea? Because you spoke, and I know you're not one of the presenters, but I'm not sure if you're presenting later, so I'll go ahead and ask you.
Well, I'll just chime in now. Timelines on plats, rezones, all entitlements and building permits. That's my magic wand. Reduce them, cut them in half, if not more. Especially, I guess I'll just elaborate on that. Like if my checkpoint that they had up here, 56 lots on R3 land, I'm building under the density, and it still cost me close to $35,000 in fees to the muni, which normally a normal plat might be $8-9 grand. But because of all the variances and other hoopla that you wouldn't go through with the PUD, it's 35 grand. You take that 35 grand, I paid consultants to do all the work for those hoops. So I probably spent all of that, if not more, on them. And then I added probably 50 grand worth of landscaping just to meet PUD. This is all to build under the recommended density for R3. So kind of by right use, shortened timelines, those are my magic wand.
Thank you. Next in the queue, we have Mr. Walden.
Thank you. So I have two questions. Number one, so we're talking about action today. We talked about lot size reform multiple times now, work sessions. We talked about it at our previous assembly retreat. Does the Community and Economic Development Committee, do you have a draft? Are we working on that? Or is anybody a co-sponsor on a draft to reduce lot sizes?
Yes, it's pretty drastic, but we have something in the works.
Okay,
That we've seen.
got it. You got a different version of something. Okay, what I think I'm just gonna put out there to my colleagues is that while there might be an alternate pathway to accomplishing that, I think we need to specifically come up with something that at least minimum brings lot sizes into alignment with the purpose statements that are already in code. I think that is an action that we could take. And then I wanted to ask about, so targeted rezones, high hurdle, the assembly allows more flexibility by right, by upzoning properties directly. Can we expound upon that a little bit?
So upzoning is the process, of course, of going from a zoning district with fewer things you can do, and fewer activities, fewer land uses, to one that allows more activities, more land uses, and generally different dimensional standards. So that would be one. If you look at the code, I think it's who can bring a rezone forward. You have to have either a property owner with maybe 1.75 acres or something, or the assembly can do it. So the assembly as a body could go through that process. But in doing that, you would be changing the existing rules that apply to somebody else's land. In an upzone, you're basically reducing the restrictions on that type of land. But people, of course, it could get tricky if you're saying, well, for your land, these new different rules apply. In general, they're less restrictive rules. But that would be the process of maybe going through and looking at the land use plan map and saying, okay, all these areas were, kind of intended to be, higher density. The assembly could take that on and say, we're willing to rezone these. And we talk to the property owners, yeah, we're okay with it. And I don't know exactly how that process would work, but that would be the assembly taking that lead rather than having the property owners take that lead.
We did massive rezonings in the 70s and in the pipeline years. Because we had to act fast. And so you're not going to wait for the individual property owner to do that.
Right, next, since he hasn't spoken, Mr. Murray, you have the floor. Myers.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Since I'm new, I've been listening and taking it all in, and I work in the real estate industry, so this is a passion of mine. I'm very, very familiar with what buyers and sellers and tenants are wanting, looking for, and then the complaints that we hear from them as well. One of the things I'm not hearing, and it's not going to be very popular, but it's a direct correlation that we all have on this body, is property taxes and millage rate. Our property taxes are exceedingly high in the municipality of Anchorage, and that burden falls down on everybody who lives here. It doesn't just fall on the property owner, it falls on the tenant, people who are living maybe in a multifamily and multiple families in an apartment, if you will, if they have to make ends meet to afford it. So another thing that's probably not very popular is we need to look at another source of revenue for the municipality instead of the burden falling on the property taxes. So that would help with the housing situation, in my opinion, if we could figure out a way to reduce that, because paying $600, $700, $800, or $1,000 a month in property taxes is unaffordable for a lot of people, especially in lower income.
Thank you, Mr. Cross.
Thank you. Andre had spoke right to where I was going, which was, we have and we established planned urban developments, PUDs, for the intention of creating affordable housing, right? It's a higher density, it's smaller requirements. But on top of that, with the conditional use permit and everything required to get it, you rob and you make it almost unaffordable. When a private developer, in order to get a replat done for a PUD, oftentimes what I've seen, Andre, I appreciate your guidance if I'm inaccurate in my opinion here. But a land developer is not necessarily the builder, but a PUD requires you almost to know down to the color of the door before you can get a project approved. Before, you get your replat done. But that individual who's developing the land is not always the builder. And builders are reluctant to say what they're willing to build on a lot until they know, because they normally say, I'll take 15 lots here, another does 12 over here. And so, when you have to go through that process, that the planning department, in order to get a PUD, not only puts all these requirements on it, but wants to know so much information before the approval, before you may be investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into something before you even know you get a yes. Meanwhile, you're still building under density. So can you speak a little bit about that? Because that has been my experience, but it may have just been a unicorn.
Well, definitely when I went through the PUD process, there's a section of the code that says you need to provide plans. And I was very clear to the municipality. I said, okay, I'm gonna give you 5 examples of plans, but I don't decide what I'm gonna build till I meet with a homeowner and they tell me what they wanna buy and what they can afford. And I like to have that flexibility. And so that, we were able to not be confined to the 5 plans I provided, but I still had to, create documents and exhibits for my application to provide those 5 plans, even though we got specific wording in the entitlement to not hold us to it. But it was just an extra hurdle. And yeah, you're correct. I don't decide what I'm going to build. The market decides what I'm going to build. I just try and push them in the right direction.
So if I may follow up, then I would wonder why when you're building under density and there's a PUD, why there's a conditional use and it's not just use. How do we look to dramatically streamline that process? If we're building under the density, we want affordable housing, we shouldn't be putting additional burdens and additional costs on smaller properties, on smaller lots, when the intention is to keep it affordable. You end up with a developer who just create larger lots and larger houses and not have that expense. Thank you. And Andre, if you want to kick in, thanks.
I'll just add to that the 2040 plan actually recommends making minimum lot sizes smaller. And we enacted the 2040 plan in probably 2020, and we haven't taken that step yet. So that's an obvious, easy step, because if smaller lot sizes were by right use in the R3, I wouldn't have gone through any of that process. I waited several years because I had this idea for 3 or 4 years. I waited for the process to catch up, or the Title 21 to catch up to my project, and it never happened. So then I said, okay, I guess I'm gonna have to go the hard way and just get this done, because I can't wait forever.
So I have myself in the queue. There's a lot of conversation about streamlining and getting faster and building more and higher and better. Tyler, you mentioned the pipeline days. And I came to Alaska before and during the kind of site condo debacles, and how we had properties that were built that didn't provide access for fire trucks. And there was a strong reaction against that. And in Mountain View in particular, in Fairview, the Marina Carina was a perfect example of what not to do. And then all of those 4 and 6 plexes that were built that literally divided a community and turned them into a place that was hostile and inhospitable, and then deteriorated and people left because it's the views. My question is, what are your thoughts, and it could be you, it could be some others, on how we make these moves without repeating the problems of the past? Because if we simply act to just expedite everything faster, more, I think we're positioning ourselves to be back here in 20 years asking ourselves, how the hell did we make this mistake? And so somewhere between the ideal of getting a bunch done and not doing anything, how do we not repeat those problems?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, when I think about when we rewrote Title 21, it was not so much a response to pipeline, there was some residual, but it was also a response to the site condo period of time in the late 90s and the early 2000s. The problem there was described to be, an aesthetic one or a changing character one or whatever it was if you were living here in 2000. And that was the sort of prevailing policy driver. Today, our driver is not that the housing that we're building is ugly. It's that we're not building any housing. So your question is, how do you make sure that you don't swing it back all the other way and sort of that we're only existing on these, both sides. We're either all building no rules or the rules are strangling us. I think it's just common sense. I think there's area in the middle. I think though that we have more to lose by not trying to light a fire under our ability to build housing than we do. I think now is not the time to be overly cautious. I still believe there's people in the permit center that are, when we sit there in the triplex, fourplex committee and fire's there saying, we're fine if you go this, we're confident that you go this route, you add another unit, we're not going to create an issue. These people are in the room. Traffic is in the room. And they're still employed to make sure that the public is safe, that we're building stuff that we can serve and sort of infrastructure that we can serve long term. So your point is well taken. There's another one that has to do with what is our vision, what do we want it all to look like? And that's something that, that could really get us bogged down.
Thanks. Yeah, I definitely don't want to bog it down. I just want to have a cautionary voice somewhere in the back of our brains that says we can err here. We should be careful as well. And just a note on process, I meant to get into this a little bit earlier. So it was just suggested that the triplex and fourplex is a committee. It's not a committee, it's a working group. And these words matter because under the open meetings laws, any body created by the assembly, whether it's committee or a subcommittee, has to operate under certain rules. But a working group is literally an independent group of up to 3 members of the assembly working with members of the community and other folks to develop legislative projects, and it's not subject to the same rules. And so why that's important is because anybody in the industry or who's a stakeholder can work with assembly members without having the sanction of a created committee or subcommittee or other task force. And so we are reserving the term working group for these more flexible, not formal projects. So it's an important distinction.
Thanks for
Mr.
having
Chair,
me
may I
in your
follow
working
up?
group.
Thank you. Ms. Allen.
Mr. Chair, may I follow up? I think you're bringing up a really great point. When we developed the update to the downtown code, we had a fabulous working group that led us through that. It included engineers, architects, landscape architects. Shanna was part of that. And we got a code where we believe now that we're going to get the development in downtown that we have envisioned for years and years and years and years. We had a wonderful working group for the parking, and now you all are working on the 4-unit thing. I think if you made some priorities, let's tackle PUD next or something like that. I think it's a great idea, and we're there to help you out.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Allen.
So I'm going to follow up on that really quick. That's one way to do things, and that's fine. And I like the working groups. There's pushback to the working groups, though, because what we don't have then is yet a piece of legislation for overall public engagement. And we really heard some pushback on that around the parking minimums in particular, that folks weren't necessarily invited to the table. So I think there's a balance there. So my question is around planned unit development. Like, this is the thing that we keep talking about, that this is supposed to be some tool that's real usable. And as I'm looking at the code suggests that it's not supposed to be this complicated. And what I'm hearing is that there tends to be a lot of complication here, that you have to possibly go down to the door color. So I guess where I'm curious, or the conversation is it an implementation problem versus a code problem? And I think we've run into this in various instances. You read the code sounds straightforward, but is it really more of an implementation issue? Because if we can get to the difference, if it's a problem in code or a problem in implementation, then we can start to figure out the right solution. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, but I mean, I was just reviewing it and it seems pretty straightforward. I mean, and I'm a layperson, I don't know all of these things. And that may feel like a really loaded question you don't want to respond to.
I don't know. This wasn't my project. I mean, I think that without going into the specifics of planned unit development, the idea of the PUD was we will give you something in exchange for something. So you can follow all the rules, and there's this door here where you go in and you do these lot sizes, or you do this, you get it. If you want to do something different, you can go through this door. And the challenge always with the PUD going back years has been the strings attached to it really tied your hands for the years then that you had to do to build the thing out. You tied you during the process. It tied you during the extra stuff you have to do. That's the landscaping that Andre's talking about that you otherwise wouldn't have had to do. So it's this sort of like, you can do this, but it's going to cost you in other ways. But I think that's where the issue is, and he figured out how to do it, and it was worth the pain to do it. What I think we're saying is to get rid of that, just make the lot sizes smaller, and we don't have to go through a PUD. We could also say we still have reasons to do a PUD, and let's make sure that we both implement it and make it pretty straightforward. The moment you get into discretion or those gray areas, and I would argue that design and building in different places, you need the discretion because it's not all the same lot. It really is a tough spot for staff to be in, and they take a position. And that's where we get into log jams, because they're trying to interpret something, who knows?
Got it. And just really briefly, what's your magic wand idea?
Well, hopefully I got a few of them coming, but I'm gonna, where Daniel, and I heard both Daniel and I talk about infrastructure, and rather than talking about ways to finance that infrastructure or fees in lieu for that infrastructure, just stop requiring offsite infrastructure in a redevelopment area for a residential development, a commercial development. We had to put $340,000 into Chugach Way. You can't tell me that has made that road any better, any safer, any more functional. And in fact, when the city comes in and redoes it years from now, they'll rip up the work that we did. Just flat out don't require it.
Mr. Vaughn, and then we're going to wrap this one up.
Thank you. I actually want to tag off of a couple of things that Member Zolotel said. First, I think it is really important that we all learn more about, all of us assembly members learn more about what's in code versus what is a matter of policy. And it's been very interesting, eye-opening to me on the triplex, fourplex working group to be learning about, when somebody goes through the permitting process, what do they get? Is it the yellow paper versus the blue paper? And all the different pathways that has to take, and then what's in code versus what's in the design criteria manual. So there's more sort of behind the scenes than just Muni code at play, and anything that we can do to support refining that, I think we'd be very interested in. I will say I really like and value the working group process because it is an opportunity, number one, for the assembly and the administration to collaborate, which I think is very needed. And number two, we're not all subject matter experts on everything. I know a lot about giving a grade eye exam. I don't know a lot about commercial real estate, for instance. And being an assembly member is so interesting because you get to drink a lot of information from a fire hose sometimes, and it's very stimulating to intellectual curiosity. But I need people who have that technical expertise to help me when I am working with members on a project sometimes. And so getting that feedback, one of the questions that we've been asking on the working group is like, okay, if we do this, if we go in and mess with Title 21 and Title 23 and do various things to try to make it easier to build triplexes and fourplexes, what are we going to break? And that's something that planning can help answer. That's something that the building department can help answer. I will say, I think the caveat to that is, to members Zolotel's point, that a working group should not abscond us from having to go through public process. And so it's the crafting of the legislation. And then I think for major changes, I think actually I will give major props to Member Zolotel and Member Rivera. When we went through the ADU ordinance, we had multiple work sessions. We invited various community councils to the table. And so for some of these big, bold policy decisions, I do think it's important to have that public process. Thanks.
Thank you. And just one clarification on something Mr. Long said. He said it's an opportunity, a working group is an opportunity for the assembly and the administration to collaborate. And I would be a little more refined and say it's an opportunity for members of the assembly and the admin to collaborate.
Up to 3.
Yeah, there's a substantial difference there in the sense that, as Ms. Alto said, we shouldn't contemplate these as shortcuts. We have to meet the minimum public process required. And at the same time, some projects have a not required, but a heightened need for a public process. So it isn't a shortcut for that. It's just an opportunity to do groundwork in a way that is more flexible before it becomes a possession of the assembly as a whole. So I think that we're gonna wrap this one up. We're right on time. We lost a little bit of time starting late. And then we're gonna take just 5 minutes. This one's gonna be the shortest break we've had yet before we reconvene for the industry panel, which is gonna be more of Tyler, more of Andre, more of Mr. Robbins. And also we're gonna be joined by Brandon Marcotte, who's in the room. One of the speakers or presenters is not gonna be able to be here because of a worksheet that came up. And so again, we'll get rolling in about 5 minutes.